Chapter 11 of The Tragic Bride. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. The Tragic Bride by Frances Brett Young. Chapter 11. When Mrs. Payne had the good luck to stumble on Considine's advertisement, for in spite of the strange complications that ensued for the Considines, the occasion was certainly fortunate for her, that remarkable person was at her wits' ends. If she had not been a woman of resource and character, as well as a devoted mother, I think she would have given up the problem of Arthur as a bad job long before this. But it was literally the only thing that really mattered to her in life, and if she had abandoned the struggle I do not know what would have become of her. By ordinary canons, Mrs. Payne could not be considered an attractive woman. The only striking features in her plain and rather expressionless face were her eyes, which were of a soft and extraordinarily beautiful gray. She had large hands and feet, no figure to speak of, and she dressed abominably. She possessed, in fact, all the virtues and none of the graces, and was, in this respect at any rate, the diametrical opposite of her son. Her appearance suggested that life had given her a tremendous battering, a condition that would have been pitiful if it were not that she also gave the impression of having doggedly survived it, and for this reason one could not help admiring her. Her husband had been a business man of exceptional brilliance, of a brilliance, indeed, that was almost pathological, and may have accounted in part for the curious mentality of Arthur. In a short but incredibly active life he had amassed a fortune that was considerable, even in the Midlands where fortunes are made. I do not know what he manufactured, but his business was conducted in Gloucester, and the Overton estate, which he acquired shortly before his death, lay under the shadow of Cotswold, between its escarpment and the isolated hill of Bredon, within 20 miles of that city. Mr. Payne had died of acute pneumonia in a sharp struggle that was in keeping with his strenuous mode of life. 7 months after his death his only child, Arthur, was born. In the care of her son and the control of the fortune to which he would later succeed, Mrs. Payne, who was blessed with an equal vocation for motherhood and finance, became happily absorbed. Everything promised well. The business in Gloucester realized more than she could have expected, and she settled down in the placid surroundings of Overton with no care in the world but Arthur's future. He was a singularly beautiful child, fair-haired, with a skin that even in manhood was dazzlingly white, and eyes that were as arresting as his mother's. A creature of immense vitality, who shook off the usual diseases of childhood without difficulty, and developed an early and almost abnormal physical perfection. He was not, it is true, particularly intelligent. He did not begin to talk until he was over 3 years old, but this slowness of development was only in keeping with his mother's physical type, and his early childhood was a period of sheer delight to her in which no shadow of the imminent trouble appeared. By the time that he had reached his 7th year, Mrs. Payne was beginning to be worried about him. His bodily health was still magnificent, but there was a strain in his character that worried her. It appeared that it was impossible for him to tell the truth. Haphazard lying is no uncommon thing in children, proceeding, as it sometimes does, from an excess of imagination and an anxiety to appear startling. But imagination was scarcely Arthur's strong point, and his lies were not haphazard, but deliberately planned. To a woman of Mrs. Payne's uncompromising truthfulness this habit appeared as a most serious failing. She could not leave it to chance, in a vague hope that Arthur would grow out of it. She tackled it, heroically and directly, by earnest persuasion, and later by punishments. By one method and another she determined to appeal to his moral sense, but after a couple of years of hopeless struggling she was driven to the conclusion that this, exactly, was what he lacked. It seemed that he had been born without one. The thing was impossible to her, for his father had been a man of exceptional probity, and without self-flattery she knew that she herself was the most transparently honest person on earth. As the boy grew older, his opportunities for showing this fatal deficiency increased. Whatever she said or did, and however sweetly he accepted her persuasions and punishments, it became evident that she, at any rate, was incapable of keeping his hands from picking and stealing, and his tongue from evil speaking, lying, and slandering. The condition was the more amazing in the face of his great natural charms. All her friends and visitors at Overton found the boy delightful. His physical beauty remained as wonderful as ever. On the surface he was a normal and exceptionally attractive child, but in her heart she realized bitterly that he was a completely amoral being. In nothing was this more apparent than in his behavior toward animals. Overton, lying as it did in the midst of a green countryside, was a natural sanctuary for all wild creatures, in which Arthur, from his earliest years, had always shown a peculiar interest. As a child he would spend many hours with the keeper, developing an instinct for woodcraft that seemed to be the strongest in his composition. He knew all the birds of the estate, their habits, their calls, their refuges. Once in the shadow of the woods, he himself was a wild animal, a creature of faunish activity and grace. Mrs. Payne always encouraged this passion of his as a natural and admirable thing, until one day the keeper, who was no more humane than the majority of keepers, came to her with a shocking story of Arthur's cruelty, an enormity that it would have taken the mind of a devil rather than a man to imagine. When she taxed the boy with it, he only laughed. She thrashed the matter out. She pointed out to him that he had done a devilish thing, but in the end she had to give it up, for it became clear to her that he was trying as hard as he could to see her point of view, but couldn't, simply because it wasn't in him. She began to realize, slowly and reluctantly, that it was no good for her to appeal to something that didn't exist. The boy had been born with a body a little above the normal, and a mind a little below the average, but nature had cruelly denied him the possession of a soul, and neither her prayers nor her devotion could give him what he congenitally lacked. She wondered whether the isolation of his life at Overton had anything to do with it, whether contact with other children of his own age would reduce him to the normal. She took the risk, and sent him, at the age of 12, to a preparatory school at Cheltenham. Before the first term was half over, they sent for her and asked her to remove him. The headmaster confessed that the case was beyond him. On the surface the boy was one of the most charming in the whole school, but his heart was an abyss of the most appalling blackness. Mrs. Payne entreated him to tell her the worst. He hedged, said that it wasn't just one thing that was wrong, but everything, everything. She asked him if he had ever known a case that resembled Arthur's. No, he thanked heaven that he hadn't. Could he advise her what to do? Lamely he suggested a tutor, and then as an afterthought a mental specialist. The word sent a chill into Mrs. Payne's heart. The idea that this bright, delightful child, the idol of her hopes, was the victim of some obscure form of moral insanity frightened her. But she was a woman of courage and determined to know the worst. She took him to a specialist in London. Arthur thoroughly enjoyed this desolating trip. The specialist talked vaguely, leaving her nothing but the faintest gleam of hope. There were more things in heaven and earth, he said, than were dreamed of in the philosophy of the most distinguished alienists. He talked indefinitely of internal secretions. It was possible, he said, and underlined the word possible, just barely possible, that in a year or two, to put it bluntly, at the time of puberty, The boy's disposition might suddenly and unaccountably change. He implored her not to count on it, and assured her that for the present medical science could do no more. If by any chance his prophecy should be fulfilled, he begged Mrs. Payne to let him know. The case, if she would pardon the use of this objectionable word, was one of the greatest professional interest. She took Arthur back to Overton and waited desperately. Tutor succeeded tutor. Each of them found Arthur charming and impossible. For herself she saw no change in him that was not physical. By this time she had abandoned any idea of finding him a profession. At the same time she was anxious to make him capable of managing the Overton estate, and though she dared not send him to one of the ordinary agricultural colleges for fear of a repetition, on a larger scale, of the Cheltenham disaster, she thought that it might be possible to find a capable land agent who would give him some kind of training and put up with his idiosyncrasy for the sake of a substantial fee. While searching for a suitable instructor, she happened to see Considine's advertisement. The fact that he gave the name of a great landowner, Lord Halberton, as a reference, convinced her that the opportunity was genuine, and the prospectus promised instruction in all the subjects that would be most useful to Arthur. The fact that only a small number of pupils was to be taken, and that the place should be regarded as a friendly country house rather than as a school, attracted her. But the part of the advertisement that finally persuaded her to a faint glimmer of hope was Considine's artfully worded final paragraph: "Special care is given to backward or difficult pupils." Like all sufferers from incurable diseases, she was only too ready to place confidence in any person who laid claim to special knowledge. She began to wonder if Considine was such a specialist. She wrote to him, looking for a miracle to save her from her afflictions. Considine replied formally. He did not jump at the idea of taking Arthur, a fact which convinced her that education at Lapton Manor was something of a privilege, and this made her disregard the fact that the privilege was expensive. Still, his note was direct and businesslike. He made it clear that if he were willing to take backward or difficult boys, he expected to be paid a little more for his trouble, but the confident tone in which he wrote suggested that he was a man who knew his business. He did know his business. Considine was a clear-headed and capable person, with a degree of confidence in himself that went a long way towards assuring his success. He proposed, finally, that it would be more satisfactory for both of them if Mrs. Payne were to visit him at Lapton, and see the place and its owners for herself. Then they could talk the matter over, and define the peculiar difficulties of Arthur's case. More and more impressed, she accepted the proposal. Considine met her train at Totnes with a dog-cart, and drove her to Lapton Manor. End of chapter 11. Recording by Roger Moline.